My husband secretly transferred every dime we owned and the deed to our custom-built mansion to his 26-year-old mistress. He was absolutely convinced he had outsmarted me and secured his future. He walked away with a smug smile, leaving me with nothing but a pair of divorce papers on our kitchen island. But just 3 days later, he was on his knees outside my door, desperate, drenched in rain, and trembling. What happened behind the scenes turned his perfect master plan into a financial nightmare he never saw coming. I am Nia, 38 years old, and the CEO of a crisis management firm. Never try to outplay a woman who cleans up multi-million-dollar messes for a living. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever watched someone dig their own grave out of sheer arrogance. Growing up in South Side Chicago taught me how to survive, but marrying into Marcus and his affluent family taught me how to hide my scars. They were the epitome of the black elite, or so they desperately wanted everyone to believe. Our six-bedroom home in the upscale suburbs of Atlanta, with its sweeping staircases and imported marble, was a fortress of his family expectations. For 7 years, I funded their lavish lifestyle while tolerating their subtle digs at my working-class roots. I maintained a flawless public image, joined the right charity boards, and smiled through every painfully fake Sunday dinner. But the ultimate betrayal did not come from his snobby sister or his entitled mother. It came from the man sleeping next to me. It was a Tuesday evening. I had just poured myself a glass of vintage Cabernet after a grueling 12-hour day dealing with corporate public relations fires. The house was quiet until the front door clicked open. Marcus walked in wearing his tailored Tom Ford suit, the exact suit I bought him for his promotion to managing director at the hedge fund. He did not greet me. He did not ask about my day. He simply strode over to the expansive marble kitchen island and slapped a thick manila envelope onto the pristine surface. The sound echoed through the vaulted ceiling, sharp and deliberate. "Sign them," he said. His voice was casual, almost bored. I looked down at the papers. Divorce. I did not gasp. I did not drop my wine glass. I looked back up at the man I had built an empire with. Marcus was 42, handsome in that polished corporate way, but tonight his eyes held a malicious gleam, a gleam of absolute triumph. "You are serving me papers on a Tuesday?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly level. "I am serving you reality, Nia," he replied, loosening his silk tie. "I am tired of living with a woman who treats our marriage like a corporate merger. I found someone who actually appreciates me. Someone who knows how to be a real woman, not just a cutthroat executive." I knew exactly who he was talking about. Chloe, his 26-year-old assistant. The girl who thought wearing designer labels she could not afford made her part of the elite. I had known about his affair for 2 years. What Marcus did not realize was that I had been patiently waiting for him to make a move. And here it was. But he was not finished. He leaned against the marble counter, crossing his arms, looking like the cat who had just swallowed the canary. His family always had this insufferable bougie attitude, pretending they were old money, when in reality, my business paid for the lifestyle he loved to flaunt. "Before you go calling your vicious little lawyers, let me save you the billable hours," he continued, a smirk playing on his lips. "You are not getting a dime. Not the investment portfolios, not the shared company stock, and definitely not this house." I tilted my head, swirling the dark red liquid in my crystal glass. "Is that so? That is exactly so." He chuckled, thoroughly enjoying his own performance. "Over the last few months, I have moved every liquid asset we share, including the deed to this very mansion, into a newly formed limited liability company, an LLC. And the sole proprietor of that LLC is Chloe." He paused, waiting for my reaction, waiting for the tears, the screaming, the begging. He wanted to see the tough, successful crisis manager crumble into a crying mess on her own kitchen floor. When I remained entirely silent, his smirk widened into a grin of pure malice. It is perfectly legal, Nia. United States corporate law at its finest. The transfer was completed, filed and sealed, before these divorce papers were ever drafted. The assets belong to the LLC. The LLC belongs to Chloe. By the time your lawyers try to pierce the corporate veil, I will be sipping mojitos in St. Bart's. You have 24 hours to pack your bags and vacate my property, or rather Chloe and her property. The sheer audacity of his speech was almost impressive. Marcus always did love the sound of his own voice. He genuinely believed he had executed the perfect financial crime against his own wife. He was relying on the fact that pre-divorce asset hiding is notoriously difficult and expensive to fight in court. He thought he had left me destitute, trapped in a legal maze that would take years to unravel. Instead, I took another sip of my wine. The vintage was bold, rich, and completely unbothered, just like me. Marcus stood there waiting for the explosion. When a full minute passed in silence, he shifted his weight. His confidence wavered just a fraction, but his massive ego quickly patched the crack. He expected tears or a screaming match, or at the very least a desperate plea for him to stay. He wanted to watch me break down and beg for my share of the life we built together. When I gave him absolutely nothing, his smug expression tightened into a scowl. I said you have 24 hours, Nia. He tapped the face of his expensive watch. It was the exact watch I had bought for him on our 5th anniversary. Do not make this harder than it has to be. Do not embarrass yourself by making me call the police to escort you off the premises. Chloe and I want to start moving her things in tomorrow afternoon, and we do not need your negative energy ruining the vibe. I placed my crystal glass on the marble counter. The soft clink seemed to echo louder than his hollow threats. I looked at him. I really looked at the man standing before me. I saw the man who had slept beside me for 7 years. The man whose family I had financially carried and whose career I had quietly orchestrated from the shadows. He truly believed he was the sole architect of this empire. He believed his own lies so deeply that he could not see the massive blind spots in his perfect plan. Marcus. I said, my voice softer and calmer than the still air in the room. Are you absolutely sure you understand the financial nature of the LLC you just transferred to your little girlfriend? He let out a loud, obnoxious laugh. It was the laugh of a man who was desperately trying to project dominance over a situation he did not fully grasp. You are pathetic, Nia. Always trying to spin the narrative. Always trying to find a loophole where there is absolutely none. You are just bitter because for the first time in your entire life, you have been completely outplayed. You cannot PR your way out of this one, sweetheart. The paperwork is ironclad. My lawyers made sure of it. I am just asking a very simple question, Marcus. I kept my eyes locked onto his, watching the slight hesitation behind his arrogant gaze. Did you read the full financial disclosures attached to the holding company before you signed it over to Chloe? Or did you just see a convenient tax haven and dive right in blindly? He scoffed loudly, waving his hand dismissively as if swatting away a harmless fly. I am a senior financial director, Nia. I built that portfolio from the ground up. Do not try to use corporate buzzwords to scare me. It is over. Accept your defeat with some dignity and pack your bags. He turned his back on me and started walking toward the sweeping grand staircase. He did not even look back as he called out over his shoulder. Leave your house keys on the kitchen counter. Chloe wants to change all the locks first thing tomorrow morning to feel safe. I watched him ascend the stairs, his posture stiff with unearned pride. He was so incredibly arrogant. That was always his fatal flaw. Marcus never looked at the fine print if the bold headlines stroked his ego. He assumed that because his name was on the shared accounts, he understood the complex machinery running underneath them. He assumed that because I was a woman, I would leave the heavy financial lifting to my big, strong husband. He completely forgot who he married. He forgot that I managed crisis communications for Fortune 500 companies. I did not just manage the daily news cycle, I managed the ultimate truth. And the truth was something I had meticulously engineered over the last 24 months. I stood alone in the grand kitchen as the silence wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. I felt no sorrow. I felt no heartbreak. I did not mourn the end of our marriage. The man who just walked up those stairs died to me the day I found his luxury hotel receipts hidden in his suit pocket 2 years ago. I did not confront him back then. Confrontation is messy. Confrontation is driven by raw emotion, and it gives the enemy time to prepare a defense. I did not want an apology. I wanted absolute control. Instead of screaming or filing for divorce immediately, I had simply smiled. I cooked his favorite meals. I attended his pretentious family gatherings and listened to his sister make passive-aggressive comments about my working-class upbringing. I played the dutiful, successful wife while silently dismantling our shared financial infrastructure piece by piece right under his nose. He thought he was hiding money from me these past few months. In reality, I was the one actively guiding him right into a carefully laid trap. Every single asset he thought he was brilliantly sheltering was a toxic liability I had deliberately wrapped in a shiny, expensive bow. I had spent 2 years restructuring our investments, quietly separating the clean money from the highly leveraged debts. He had no idea that the LLC he just proudly gifted to his young mistress was about to become an anchor that would drag them both to the absolute bottom of the ocean. He thought he gave her a fortune. He actually gave her a financial death sentence. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. I had one new message from my lead attorney confirming that the final legal trap had been successfully set and the grace period had expired. The timing was absolute perfection. By the time Marcus and his greedy family realized what was actually happening, it would be far too late to reverse the damage. They were going to lose everything they valued most in this world: their money, their elite status, and their precious public image. I walked over to the home security panel on the wall and permanently disabled my personal access codes. I did not need them anymore. I had already secured a stunning luxury penthouse in the heart of the city under a blind trust they could never trace. My designer bags and essential documents had been packed for weeks, sitting safely in the trunk of my car at my office building. I was walking away with the real wealth while leaving them behind with a crumbling illusion. I grabbed my purse, smoothed out my blazer, and walked right out the front door into the cool night air. I did not look back at the mansion. It was no longer my problem. It belonged to Chloe now, and she was welcome to every single nightmare that came with it. Never challenge a crisis management expert. Hit like and subscribe to see how long it takes for this man-perfect plan to put him on his knees. The next morning, I drove back to the mansion. I had promised Marcus I would leave the house keys on the kitchen counter, and I am a woman of my word. I also wanted one last look at the pristine environment before the absolute chaos descended upon it. It was exactly 8 in the morning when I heard the heavy sound of a key turning in the front door. I was standing in the grand foyer, buttoning my designer coat, as the massive oak door swung wide open. In walked Desiree. She was Marcus' younger sister and the self-appointed gatekeeper of their family elite status. Trailing right behind her was her husband Trent, a white tech developer who wore $1,000 sneakers and always spoke to everyone as if he was delivering a keynote speech. Behind them stood a nervous-looking man in a gray uniform holding a heavy toolbox. They had actually brought a locksmith. Desiree stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me standing calmly by the staircase. She looked me up and down with that familiar sneer she had been practicing for 7 long years. Her perfectly laid hair and obnoxious fur-trimmed coat screamed of someone desperately trying to prove they belonged to the upper class. She crossed her arms and let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "Well, I am honestly surprised you are still here, Nia," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I half expected to come in and find the silver and the expensive artwork missing. I always told Marcus you can take a girl out of the south side of Chicago, but you cannot wash the hood off of her. It is in your blood. You probably thought you hit the ultimate jackpot when you tricked my brother into marrying you. I did not blink. I simply watched her perform. Desiree lived for drama, and she loved nothing more than trying to put me in my place. She hated me from the moment Marcus introduced us. She hated that I did not come from a family with a legacy name, and she hated that I built my wealth with my own two hands instead of inheriting it. You know, she continued, stepping further into the foyer as if she already owned the property. Marcus is the absolute pride of our family. He is the definition of black excellence. He is a senior executive, and he belongs with someone who actually understands our world. Chloe is a perfect fit for us. She comes from a respectable background. Her family actually summers in Martha's Vineyard. Where does your family summer, Nia? On a concrete porch in the city. Chloe is elegant and soft, and she actually knows how to host a charity gala without making it feel like a cheap block party. She fits our image flawlessly. You were always just a temporary charity project for him. The locksmith stood awkwardly in the corner, unsure if he should start drilling into the heavy oak door. Trent clapped the man on the shoulder and pointed at the lock. "Get to work, buddy," Trent said with a smug smirk. "The old tenant is just gathering her cheap things, and she will be out of your hair in a minute." I looked at Trent. He was the classic arrogant tech bro who thought his startup funding made him untouchable. He married into a wealthy black family and immediately adopted their bougie, elitist attitude as if he had been born into it. He loved talking down to me because I actually worked for my wealth instead of manipulating investors for it. Desiree walked past me, running her hand over the expensive marble console table. "We are going to have to completely fumigate and sage this entire house," she sighed dramatically. "Chloe has such refined taste. She is already planning to redecorate the master bedroom and get rid of all your tacky modern furniture. You know she and Marcus are going to be hosting the city mayor next month. It is so refreshing to finally have a sister-in-law who knows how to behave around high society. Someone who does not smell like cheap ambition and desperation." I listened to her speech with genuine amusement. Desiree was so incredibly confident in her cruelty. She truly believed that because her family had money, they were inherently better than everyone else. She completely forgot that before I came along, their precious family business was teetering on the edge of massive bankruptcy. I was the one who restructured their hidden debts. I was the one who introduced Marcus to the powerful board members who eventually hired him. They loved to pretend they were self-made royalty, but the absolute truth was that I built the financial throne they were so proudly sitting on. I stepped closer to Desiree. She instinctively took a half step back, but quickly caught herself lifting her chin to maintain her fragile facade of superiority. "Are you quite finished, Desiree?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, void of any emotion. I was not angry. You cannot be angry at a clown for simply acting like a clown. "I am just getting started," she spat back, her eyes narrowing. "You need to understand that this is the absolute end of the road for you. You are getting cut off from the country club. You are getting cut off from the charity boards. Everyone in our social circle already knows that Marcus dumped you for a younger, prettier model. You are going back to exactly where you came from. So grab whatever cheap Target clothes you have left upstairs and get out of Chloe Newhouse before we have you thrown out." Trent let out a condescending chuckle and adjusted his expensive watch. "Look, Nia, we do not want to make this ugly," Trent said, crossing his arms and leaning against the wall. "My tech company just secured another massive round of funding, and Marcus is about to take over as the senior partner at the fund. We are moving into a different tax bracket, a completely different stratosphere of society. You just do not fit the picture anymore. Be grateful Marcus was generous enough to give you a 24-hour warning. Most men would have just thrown your bags on the front lawn. Walk away quietly, Nia. You do not want to mess with people who have better lawyers and much deeper pockets than you." Better lawyers, deeper pockets. The phrases almost made me laugh out loud. Trent had absolutely no idea who he was talking to. He did not know that my elite legal team was currently sipping premium coffee in a high-rise downtown, watching his entire financial world prepare to collapse. He did not know the massive secrets I had already set into motion. I looked around the grand foyer, taking in the crystal chandelier and the custom hardwood floors. They loved this house so much. They worshipped the image of success far more than they understood the brutal mechanics of actual wealth. Desiree was still glaring at me, her arms crossed defensively. She was waiting for me to snap. She wanted me to yell and scream so she could call me an angry, bitter woman and feel completely justified in her cruelty. She wanted a dramatic reaction she could gossip about at her next ladies' brunch. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the heavy set of house keys. I tossed them lightly onto the marble table where they landed with a sharp metallic clatter. "They are all yours, Desiree," I said, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "Tell Marcus I said goodbye. And please give Chloe my warmest congratulations. She really earned every single thing coming to her." I turned my back on them and walked toward the front door, passing the confused locksmith, who immediately stepped out of my way. I could feel Desiree staring daggers into my back, but she did not say another word. She had fired all her best shots, and I had not even flinched. As I walked down the long paved driveway toward my car, the morning sun was just starting to warm the crisp air. I felt lighter than I had in 7 years. The toxic, suffocating weight of the Marcus family was finally off my shoulders. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the mansion without a single backward glance. The stage was set. The arrogant actors were all in place and blindly reading their scripts. Now all I had to do was sit back in my new penthouse, pour another glass of wine, and wait for the spectacular show to begin. I turned my attention away from Desiree and looked directly at Trent. He was standing there with his chest puffed out, wearing his expensive tech company fleece and a smug grin that desperately needed to be wiped off his face. He thought his little speech about deeper pockets and better lawyers had intimidated me. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him. "Deeper pockets, Trent?" I asked, letting the words roll off my tongue with a hint of amusement. "That is a very interesting choice of words coming from you." Trent crossed his arms, defensive, but still trying to maintain his arrogant posture. "I am just giving you some friendly advice, Nia. Do not make this harder than it has to be. My company valuation just hit 10 million. You are out of your league." 10 million, I repeated, nodding slowly, as if I was impressed. "That is a fantastic number. But tell me, Trent, does that 10 million valuation factor in the $50,000 you begged me to loan you last October to keep the Internal Revenue Service from freezing your personal assets?" The silence that fell over the grand foyer was so absolute you could hear a pin drop. Trent dropped his arms immediately. His smug grin vanished instantly, replaced by a look of sheer terror. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. Desiree whipped her head around to stare at her husband. Her fake eyelashes fluttered in rapid shock. "What is she talking about, Trent?" she demanded, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its previous fake elegance. "What $50,000? I kept my eyes locked on Trent, watching him squirm under the crushing weight of the truth. "I am talking about the frantic phone call I received at 2 in the morning," I said, projecting my voice so it echoed perfectly off the marble floors. "I am talking about your husband driving to my office in tears because he had committed federal tax fraud with his startup seed money. He was about to be indicted, Desiree. He was terrified that you would leave him if you found out he was actually broke. So I wrote him a personal check from my private account to quietly pay off his tax penalties and keep him out of federal prison." "That is a lie," Trent stammered, taking a step back. His voice cracked. He looked desperately at Desiree. "Baby, she is lying. She is just trying to cause trouble because she is mad about Marcus. She is making it all up." I reached into my designer handbag and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen a few times and pulled up a digital copy of the cleared check. It had his undeniable signature right on the endorsement line, alongside a desperate text message he had sent me thanking me for saving his life. I turned the screen around and held it up right in front of Desiree's face. "I do not make things up, Trent," I said coldly. "I document them." Desiree stared at the glowing screen. Her eyes widened as she recognized her husband's handwriting. Her breathing grew heavy and erratic. The pristine, unified front they had walked in with was now completely shattered into a million unfixable pieces. She turned to Trent, her face contorted with pure rage. You swore to me that the startup was fully funded, she screamed, her voice echoing through the mansion. You told me you bought my diamond anniversary band with the company profits. Did you buy my ring with her money? Did you beg my brother wife for a handout behind my back, you pathetic loser? Desiree, please just let me explain, Trent pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. It was a temporary cash flow problem. I was going to pay her back. I swear I was going to pay it back. I just did not want you to worry. You committed federal tax fraud, Desiree shrieked, stepping toward him and jabbing her manicured finger into his chest. You lied to me for an entire year. My brother is a senior financial director, and my husband is a common criminal begging for scraps. How dare you embarrass me like this? I stood back and watched the beautiful chaos unfold. This was the exact reason I had kept that secret locked away. I never used it to blackmail him, and I never brought it up during family dinners. I saved it for the precise moment when it would inflict the absolute maximum amount of collateral damage. Trent had tried to use his fake tech wealth to belittle my working-class roots. Now his own wife was looking at him like he was a piece of trash stuck to the bottom of her shoe. The locksmith, who was still standing awkwardly by the front door, slowly took a few steps backward, trying to blend into the wallpaper. He clearly wanted no part of this family meltdown. I think I will leave you two to sort out your finances, I said, breaking through their screaming match. My voice was calm and completely unbothered. Desiree, you might want to hold off on saging the house and redecorating the master bedroom. You should probably save your energy for the divorce attorneys. I hear they charge extra when federal crimes are involved. Neither of them responded to me. Desiree was too busy screaming at Trent, and Trent was too busy trying to stop her from hitting him with her expensive handbag. Their supposed elite lifestyle was nothing but a fragile house of cards, and all it took was one breath of truth from me to bring the entire thing crashing down. Walking to the front door, I felt an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. This was the core principle of crisis management. When your enemies form a united front against you, the most efficient way to defeat them is to introduce a single piece of undeniable truth that destroys their trust in one another. Marcus had sent them here to intimidate me and make sure I left quietly. He thought his sister and brother-in-law would be the perfect enforcers. He never calculated the risk that I held all of their darkest secrets in the palm of my hand. I left the heavy set of house keys right on the marble console table, just like Marcus wanted. As I stepped out into the crisp morning air, I could still hear Desiree yelling from inside the foyer. The unbreakable alliance of the bougie family was officially broken. They had come to gloat over my downfall, but instead, they were eating each other alive. I climbed into my car and started the engine. It purred smoothly, matching my steady heartbeat. Trent and Desiree were so distracted by their own imploding marriage that they would not even think to call Marcus and warn him about my calm demeanor. They would be too busy contacting their own lawyers and securing their own bank accounts. I had successfully neutralized his first line of defense without raising my voice once. The first domino had fallen flawlessly. Now it was time for the rest of his stolen empire to collapse. I pulled out of the gates of the neighborhood, leaving the screaming couple and the mansion far behind me. The real game had only just begun. I had barely shifted my car into reverse when a sleek black Porsche Panamera aggressively swerved into the driveway, completely blocking my exit. Marcus had arrived early to claim his prize, and he did not come alone. The passenger door opened, and out stepped Chloe. She was exactly what you would expect a 26-year-old mistress to look like when she thinks she has just won the ultimate lottery. She was draped in a loud logo, heavy designer outfit that screamed new money and desperation. She wore oversized sunglasses despite the morning overcast and carried a luxury handbag that I knew for a fact Marcus had purchased using our joint credit card last month. Marcus stepped out of the driver's seat, looking incredibly smug. He walked up to my window and tapped on the glass with his knuckles. I rolled the window down, keeping my expression completely neutral. He leaned in and told me to turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle. He casually informed me that the car I was driving had been purchased under the holding company umbrella, and therefore it was now the legal property of his new LLC. He wanted to strip me of absolutely everything, right down to my daily transportation. He wanted to see me walking down the street with my bags in my hands so his victory could be absolute. I did not argue with him. Arguing is what losers do when they realize they have no leverage left to pull. I knew perfectly well that the car was tied to the same toxic financial web I had carefully constructed over the past 2 years. Let him have the car. Let him have all the depreciating assets he wanted. I calmly turned off the ignition, grabbed my single small suitcase from the passenger seat, and stepped out onto the paved driveway. I tossed the car keys directly into his hands without a single word of protest. Marcus looked slightly disappointed that I had not put up a fight, but his massive ego quickly recovered. He tossed the keys to Chloe, who caught them with a victorious little giggle. She saw her opportunity to assert her dominance and strutted over to me, her expensive high heels clicking loudly against the concrete pavement. A cloud of overly sweet, expensive perfume followed her every move. She stopped just a few feet away from me, looking me up and down with an expression of pure condescension. She told me that I should not take this personally. She said in a sickly, sweet voice that Marcus simply needed a real woman to build a legacy with, and that I was always too busy acting like a man in the boardroom to be a proper wife. She told me that it was time for me to go back to my roots on the South Side and let the real elite handle the high society life. She recited the insults perfectly. I could tell she had been rehearsing this little speech in her bathroom mirror for weeks. She desperately wanted me to feel small so she could finally feel big. Then she opened her designer bag and reached inside. She pulled out a crisp $100 bill. She held it out, but she did not hand it to me. Instead, she opened her fingers and deliberately let the bill drop to the ground at my feet. She smiled a nasty, triumphant smile and told me to call an Uber because it was a long walk back to the ghetto. Marcus stood a few feet away, leaning against his Porsche with his arms crossed. He was grinning from ear to ear, thoroughly enjoying the humiliating show his new mistress was putting on for him. They both waited for my reaction. They wanted me to scream or cry or slap her across the face. They wanted a dramatic scene that they could laugh about later over expensive cocktails. I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the cold driveway pavement. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel angry. I felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity for the naive little girl standing in front of me. She had absolutely no idea what she had just signed her name to. She thought she was inheriting a life of boundless luxury and endless shopping sprees. She did not know that she was now the sole legal proprietor of a corporate shell carrying millions of dollars in toxic margin debt. She thought she had just conquered my kingdom, but in reality she had just locked herself inside a burning building and swallowed the only key. I slowly bent down and picked up the $100 bill. I smoothed out the creases with my fingers, taking my time. I looked up and met Chloe directly in the eyes. I gave her a cold, empty smile that made her victorious smirk falter for just a fraction of a second. I tucked the crisp bill neatly into the pocket of my designer coat. "Keep the house, Chloe," I said, my voice soft but laced with lethal precision. "You are going to need it." Before she could process the weight of my words, a massive black luxury town car pulled smoothly into the driveway, stopping just behind Marcus. I had scheduled my private chauffeur to arrive exactly at this time, knowing Marcus would try a stunt like taking my vehicle. The driver, wearing a crisp black suit, stepped out and immediately took my small suitcase, loading it into the trunk. He opened the back door for me and waited respectfully. I did not look back at Marcus or Chloe as I slid into the plush leather seat of the town car. The driver closed the door with a solid, comforting thud, shutting out the toxic world I was finally leaving behind. As we backed out of the driveway, I looked out the tinted window one last time. Marcus and Chloe were standing frozen on the pavement, watching me leave in absolute luxury instead of the humiliating defeat they had planned. They turned around and started walking up the grand stone steps toward the front door of the mansion. They had absolutely no idea that they were walking straight into an active war zone. Desiree and Trent were still inside that house, viciously tearing each other apart over the federal tax fraud secret I had just detonated in the foyer. The perfect bougie family was already imploding from the inside out. Marcus was about to walk into a screaming match with his sister, and Chloe was about to start her first day as a homeowner in a house full of absolute chaos. I leaned back against the headrest and let out a long, slow breath. The morning sun was shining brightly over the Atlanta skyline. The first phase of my exit strategy had been executed flawlessly. I had successfully separated myself from the impending wreckage and left the arrogant fools to feast on one another. I told the driver to head to my new penthouse downtown. It was time to pour a fresh cup of coffee, sit back, and wait for the banks to open. The financial guillotine was primed and ready to drop. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new downtown penthouse, holding a fresh cup of dark roast coffee and watching the city lights begin to flicker on against the twilight sky. My phone buzzed silently on the marble counter. It was a secure message from my lead private investigator. I never leave anything to chance. When you orchestrate the complete financial ruin of a man who betrayed you, it is absolutely essential to have eyes on the ground to monitor the fallout. I opened the file and smiled. The automated security protocols at his bank had officially triggered at the close of the business day. The guillotine had dropped right on schedule. Marcus and Chloe had decided to celebrate their grand victory that evening at one of the most exclusive Michelin-starred restaurants in Atlanta. It was a notoriously pretentious establishment where the waitlist was 6 months long and the tasting menu cost more than a standard mortgage payment. Marcus loved places like this because they validated his desperate need to feel superior. He wanted to show his young mistress the glamorous life he claimed he built all by himself. According to the detailed report from my investigator, who was seated quietly at the bar, nursing a bourbon, the happy couple put on quite the pathetic show. Chloe strutted into the elegant dining room wearing a loud sequined dress that was entirely inappropriate for the refined atmosphere. She laughed too loudly and spoke just high enough so the neighboring tables could hear her bragging about her massive new custom-built mansion. She wanted everyone in the room to know she had arrived. Marcus sat across from her, soaking in her shallow adoration. He ordered the imported beluga caviar to start. He demanded the highest-grade Wagyu beef for their main course. He even called over the head sommelier and confidently ordered a bottle of vintage champagne that cost upwards of $800. They ate and drank like royalty, completely oblivious to the fact that their entire kingdom was currently burning to the ground. After 2 hours of lavish indulgence, the waiter approached their table carrying a sleek black leather folder. He placed the check gently next to Marcus. The total was easily over $2,000. Marcus did not even bother to open the folder to review the itemized receipt. He simply reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, pulled out his heavy metal American Express black card, and dropped it onto the leather with a loud, arrogant thud. He gave Chloe a smug wink, leaning back in his chair like a king who had just conquered the world. The waiter took the card and walked away toward the point-of-sale terminal. For a few minutes, Marcus and Chloe continued their obnoxious celebration, taking selfies with their empty champagne flutes. But the wait started to stretch longer than usual. When the waiter finally returned, his posture was slightly rigid and his expression was carefully neutral. He leaned down and spoke in a hushed professional tone so as not to disturb the other wealthy patrons. He politely informed Marcus that the card had been declined. Marcus let out a loud, arrogant scoff. He told the waiter that it was obviously a system error on the restaurant side. He loudly reminded the staff member that he was a senior financial director at a major hedge fund and that his credit limit was virtually non-existent. He demanded they run the heavy metal card again. The waiter maintained his polite composure, apologized for the inconvenience, and walked back to the terminal. A heavy silence began to settle over their table. Chloe stopped giggling. She looked around nervously, noticing that a few of the surrounding diners, the actual elite of the city, were beginning to glance over at the commotion. There is nothing the fake wealthy fear more than the judgment of the actually wealthy. A minute later, the restaurant general manager walked over to their table, accompanied by the waiter. The manager handed the black card back to Marcus with a tight, apologetic smile. He explained that the merchant services system had flagged the account and placed a hard hold on the transaction. The card was completely frozen. The blood drained rapidly from Marcus' face. He turned a pale, sickening shade of gray. His arrogant facade cracked instantly. He frantically reached into his designer wallet and pulled out a platinum Visa card tied directly to his personal checking account. He practically shoved it into the manager's hand. 3 minutes later, the manager returned. Declined. Marcus' hands began to shake. He pulled out a corporate expense card from his hedge fund. Declined. Panic set in, pure, unadulterated panic. Marcus pulled out his cell phone and furiously dialed his private banking concierge. He demanded to know what was going on. What he did not realize was that earlier that afternoon, when he officially filed the paperwork transferring our shared holding company into Chloe's name, he triggered a catastrophic financial domino effect. By removing my blind trust from the equation, the debt-to-asset ratio of his remaining portfolio had crashed. The $4 million margin loan tied to his investments went into immediate default. The bank had issued an automated margin call at 3 in the afternoon. When Marcus failed to respond because he was too busy helping his mistress move into my old house, the bank initiated a total freeze on every single account bearing his social security number to prevent capital flight. He was cut off. Every dime he thought he owned was locked behind a digital brick wall. Chloe was sitting frozen in her chair. The embarrassment was suffocating her. The neighboring tables were no longer pretending not to look. They were openly staring at the couple who had just ordered caviar and vintage champagne but could not afford to pay the bill. Chloe hated looking poor more than anything in the entire world, and right now she looked like a cheap scam artist. Marcus hung up the phone, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped the device. He looked across the table at his young mistress, his eyes wide with sheer terror. He had to do the most humiliating thing a sugar daddy could ever possibly do. He had to lean across the table and quietly beg his 26-year-old assistant to pull out her own basic credit card to cover the $2,000 dinner. Chloe's face turned bright red with humiliation and fury. She dug into her knockoff designer purse and handed over her card, which barely had enough available limit to cover the meal and a minimal tip. The second the receipt was signed, they practically sprinted out of the restaurant, fleeing into the night like absolute cowards. The pristine, invincible image Marcus had projected just a few hours ago in my kitchen was completely shattered. And the best part was that this was only the very first course of the nightmare I had prepared for them. The morning of day 2 arrived with a harsh reality check for my soon-to-be ex-husband. I was sitting comfortably in my penthouse enjoying a fresh croissant when my investigator sent me the next update. Marcus did not sleep a wink after the humiliating exit from the restaurant. At exactly 8:55 in the morning, he was pacing furiously outside the heavy glass doors of his private bank downtown, waiting for them to open. He was wearing the same suit from the night before, heavily wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale sweat and panic. The second the security guard unlocked the doors, Marcus pushed past him and marched directly to the private banking suites. He did not stop at the reception desk. He did not wait to be announced. He barged straight into the corner office of the senior branch manager, a man named David, who had catered to Marcus and his massive ego for the past 5 years. David looked up in shock as Marcus slammed his hands down on the mahogany desk. Marcus immediately launched into a furious tirade. He yelled about the absolute embarrassment he had suffered at the restaurant. He demanded to know why a senior financial director was having his cards declined like some common college student. He threatened to pull every single dime of his investments out of the bank and move them to a competitor by the end of the day if the hold was not lifted immediately. He wanted heads to roll, and he wanted his money unfrozen right that very second. David remained perfectly calm. He was a seasoned banker who was very used to dealing with angry, arrogant men who thought their wealth made them immune to the rules. He quietly asked Marcus to take a seat while he pulled up the account profiles on his computer. Marcus refused to sit. He paced back and forth across the plush carpet, running his hands through his uncombed hair and muttering threats about lawsuits and ruined careers. After a few agonizing minutes of typing, David took his hands off the keyboard and looked up at Marcus with a grim expression. He did not offer an apology. Instead, he delivered the exact script I knew he would. David calmly explained that there was absolutely nothing he could do. He told Marcus that a massive margin debt call had been automatically triggered by the risk assessment algorithm the previous afternoon. Marcus stopped pacing. He stared at the banker, his arrogant anger suddenly giving way to deep confusion. He demanded to know what margin call David was talking about. He insisted his portfolio was heavily diversified and perfectly healthy. That is when David laid out the brutal mathematical reality. He explained that up until yesterday, the high-risk leveraged investments in the portfolio were balanced out and secured by a substantial blind trust. That blind trust, of course, was my money. The clean liquid assets I had spent 2 years quietly separating from his risky financial bets. David informed Marcus that when the asset transfer paperwork was filed yesterday afternoon, moving the holding company into the new LLC, the system immediately recognized that the blind trust was no longer attached as collateral. Without my money shielding his reckless investments, the debt-to-asset ratio of the holding company had instantly collapsed. The portfolio was carrying $4 million in toxic margin debt. And because the LLC had just been transferred to a new sole proprietor with absolutely zero credit history and zero verifiable income, the bank took immediate protective action. They issued a $4 million margin call, requiring the debt to be satisfied by the close of business. When that did not happen, they initiated a total freeze on every single account associated with the holding company and its previous guarantors. Marcus physically staggered backward. His knees hit the edge of a leather guest chair and he collapsed into it. The color completely vanished from his face for the second time in 12 hours. He tried to speak, but his mouth only opened and closed wordlessly. He finally managed to choke out a desperate question. He asked David to just reverse the transfer. He pleaded with the banker to undo the LLC paperwork and move the assets back into his name so the algorithm would recognize his executive income and release the hold. David looked at him with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. He explained that a bank cannot simply reverse a legally binding corporate asset transfer. The paperwork Marcus had signed and filed with the state was ironclad. Marcus had bragged to me just yesterday about how brilliant and legally untouchable his maneuver was. He had hired expensive corporate lawyers to make absolutely sure the transfer could not be contested or undone by a bitter wife during a divorce. He had locked the door, welded it shut, and thrown the only key into the ocean. The LLC and all of its massive debt now legally belonged to Chloe. And because Marcus had been the primary guarantor on those accounts prior to the transfer, the bank was holding his personal accounts hostage until the $4 million debt was cleared. Marcus sat frozen in the chair. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him like a tidal wave. He had spent months secretly plotting to leave me with absolutely nothing. He thought he was walking away with a fortune to start a new glamorous life with his young assistant. Instead, he had unknowingly handed her a worthless corporate shell carrying a multi-million-dollar financial bomb. He had effectively bankrupted himself and his mistress in a single afternoon. David asked Marcus if he would be able to wire the $4 million from an outside institution to cover the margin call and unfreeze the accounts. It was a standard banking question, but it felt like a cruel joke. Marcus had no outside institutions. Everything he had was tied up in that one holding company. He had put all his eggs in one basket and handed that basket directly to a 26-year-old who could not even afford her own rent. Marcus did not answer the banker. He slowly stood up from the leather chair. His arrogant posture was completely gone, replaced by the heavy slump of a defeated man. He did not yell anymore. He did not threaten any lawsuits. He just turned around and walked out of the corner office like a zombie. He stumbled through the polished lobby of the bank, completely ignoring the stares of the tellers and security guards. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the busy downtown street. He was a senior financial director who had just lost every single penny to his name because he was too arrogant to read the fine print, and the most beautiful part of it all was that he could not blame anyone but himself. He had built the trap, set the bait, and happily stepped right onto the trigger. Marcus stood on the busy downtown sidewalk, completely numb. The noise of the city traffic faded into a dull roar as the sheer magnitude of his failure crushed the breath out of his lungs. He had absolutely no cash. His credit cards were useless pieces of plastic. He could not even afford to buy a cup of coffee, let alone pay off a $4 million margin call. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He had to swallow every single ounce of his massive pride because he had exactly one lifeline left. Trent. Just yesterday, Trent had stood in my grand foyer bragging about his tech company securing a $10 million valuation. Marcus hated asking his obnoxious brother-in-law for anything but desperate times called for desperate measures. If Trent could just wire him the $4 million as a short-term bridge loan, the bank would unfreeze the holding company accounts. Marcus could liquidate some assets, pay Trent back with interest, and somehow salvage his career before the board of directors found out. It was a humiliating plan, but it was his only plan. He scrolled through his contacts and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before the line clicked open. Marcus did not even bother saying hello. He launched straight into his desperate pitch. Trent, I need a massive favor. He pleaded, his voice completely stripped of its usual commanding tone. I ran into a temporary liquidity issue with the new LLC transfer. The bank locked down my accounts over a margin call. I need you to wire me $4 million immediately. I will pay you back by Friday with a 20% premium. Please, Trent, I am begging you. Marcus stopped talking and waited for the arrogant tech bro to gloat. He expected Trent to demand a pound of flesh or a controlling stake in the hedge fund. What he did not expect was the sound coming through the earpiece. Trent was not gloating. Trent was screaming. Are you out of your mind? Trent shrieked, his voice cracking with sheer hysteria. Are you absolutely insane, Marcus? A wire transfer. I cannot even buy a tank of gas right now. Marcus pulled the phone away from his ear for a second, confused by the sheer panic in the other man's voice. In the background, he could hear the distinct sound of Desiree sobbing uncontrollably and the heavy thud of furniture being moved or broken. Trent, what is going on? Marcus asked, his stomach tying itself into a tighter knot. The IRS, Marcus Trent wailed, sounding like a terrified child instead of a $10 million tech founder. Federal agents just raided my corporate office an hour ago. They walked right past the receptionist and confiscated every single computer server and hard drive in the building. They showed up at the house 10 minutes later with a federal warrant. They seized my passports. They seized Desiree bank accounts. Everything is gone, Marcus. Every single penny I have ever made has been frozen by the federal government. Marcus felt his knees go weak. What do you mean seized? He stammered. How does the IRS just seize a $10 million company overnight without any warning? Because someone sent them a completely organized anonymous whistleblower dossier, Trent screamed, his voice echoing with absolute despair. Someone handed them my entire financial life on a silver platter. Every hidden offshore account. Every fake vendor invoice I used to dodge corporate taxes. The $50,000 bailout from last year. They have all of it, Marcus. The lead agent told me the dossier was so thoroughly documented, they were able to secure an emergency federal injunction to freeze my assets before I could move the money. I am facing 20 years in federal prison. My investors are already pulling out and Desiree is packing her bags to leave me. Marcus leaned heavily against a brick wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the dirty pavement. He could not process the nightmare unfolding around him. But Trent, I need that $4 million, he whispered stubbornly, clinging to his own selfish delusion. I am ruined if I do not clear this margin call today. We are all ruined, you absolute idiot, Trent roared through the phone. Do you not see what is happening? Do you really think it is a coincidence that my entire life is imploding on the exact same morning you get locked out of your fortune? It is Nia. It is your brilliant, calculated wife. You thought you were so incredibly smart moving your assets to your little girlfriend. You thought Nia was just going to pack her bags and cry. She did not just walk away, Marcus. She orchestrated a mass execution, and we all lined up perfectly for the firing squad. Do not ever call this number again. The line went completely dead. Marcus sat on the sidewalk staring blankly at the screen of his phone. The reality of Trent's words slowly seeped into his panicked brain. It was me. Of course it was me. Back in my penthouse, I was sitting comfortably on my velvet sofa watching the live news feed on my tablet. A local business channel was already reporting on the sudden IRS raid at a prominent local tech startup. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the rich, dark flavor wash over me. Trent was absolutely right. The timing was not a coincidence. It was a masterpiece of crisis management strategy. When Trent came crying to me a year ago, begging for $50,000 to cover up his tax fraud, I did not just write him a check and forget about it. I am a professional. I do the deep research. I hired a forensic accountant to trace exactly where Trent had been hiding his startup funds. I spent months compiling a flawless, airtight dossier of his federal crimes. I mapped out his offshore shell companies, his fake employee payrolls, and his illegal deductions. I built a legal weapon so powerful it could decimate his entire life with a single click. But I did not use it right away. A good strategist never plays her best card when the stakes are low. I waited. I kept that dossier locked away in a secure, encrypted server. I waited for the day Marcus would finally make his move. Yesterday morning, when Trent and Desiree stood in my foyer demanding I leave the mansion, I knew the time had come. The moment I drove away from that house, I made one single encrypted phone call to the IRS whistleblower hotline and transmitted the entire file. I knew the federal government moved aggressively when handed a silver platter of evidence, and I knew they would freeze Trent accounts before the sun came up today. I completely neutralized Marcus' only financial lifeline right before he even realized he was drowning. They wanted to destroy my life and throw me out on the street. Instead, I had isolated Marcus on an island of toxic debt and systematically burned down every single bridge he could possibly use to escape. Marcus was now sitting on a city sidewalk entirely alone, entirely broke and completely out of options. His family wealth was a smoking crater. His sister was currently watching federal agents carry boxes of evidence out of her home, and the young mistress he thought he was protecting was currently the sole legal owner of a massive unpayable debt. The dominoes were falling with absolute brutal perfection. But I was not finished yet. Destroying his wealth was only the second phase. To complete the job, I had to destroy his career. I turned off the news feed on my tablet and took a deep breath. You are probably wondering how a senior financial director, a man whose entire career is built on analyzing risk, could be so completely blind to his own financial ruin. Let me break it down for you. I manage crises for a living. When a Fortune 500 company is about to go under, I do not panic. I do not throw a tantrum. I assess the assets, I isolate the liabilities, and I completely control the narrative. When I found the luxury hotel receipts 2 years ago and realized Marcus was sleeping with his 26-year-old assistant, I treated my marriage exactly like a failing corporation. I did not cry. I did not confront him. I went to work. 2 years is a very long time to play the loving, supportive wife to a man you absolutely despise. It requires a level of discipline that most people simply do not possess. But I needed that time to untangle our lives without raising a single red flag. Marcus and I had built a massive portfolio together, but Marcus was inherently greedy. He loved high-risk investments. He loved leveraging our solid assets to take out massive margin loans so he could play the big shot on Wall Street and impress his bougie family. As long as my clean money and my pristine business reputation were backing up his wild bets, the banks were perfectly happy to lend him millions of dollars. So I decided it was time to quietly remove his safety net. I hired the best discreet legal team in the state and quietly established a blind trust. A blind trust is a brilliant financial vehicle where the holdings are managed completely out of sight. And more importantly, it is entirely shielded from standard asset searches during a divorce. Slowly and methodically, over the course of 24 months, I began funneling my real wealth into that trust. I moved the intellectual property of my public relations firm. I quietly transitioned all of my top-tier VIP clients to new ironclad contracts under a completely different corporate umbrella that I fully controlled. I made sure the revenue streams that actually kept our lifestyle afloat were legally severed from his name. Every single time Marcus bragged about a new risky investment or went on a weekend getaway with Chloe, I used his distraction to siphon off more of our clean liquid cash into the trust. By the time Marcus decided he was ready to divorce me, the primary holding company we shared was completely hollowed out. It looked incredible on paper. It held the deed to the custom-built mansion and a portfolio of flashy tech stocks. But underneath that shiny surface, it was nothing more than a toxic shell. It was carrying $4 million in highly leveraged margin debt. The only thing keeping the bank from calling in that massive debt was the fact that my clean credit and my business revenue were still legally tied to the account as a guarantor. I knew Marcus would try to hide the assets before he handed me the divorce papers. It is the absolute oldest trick in the arrogant Wall Street playbook. He thought if he transferred the holding company to a new LLC, he could claim he had zero assets during the divorce proceedings. He wanted to leave me with nothing so he could start a wealthy new life with his mistress. So I let him. I made sure the paperwork for the transfer was easily accessible in his home office. I even casually mentioned over dinner one night how difficult it was for spouses to pierce the corporate veil of an LLC during a divorce. I planted the seed, and his massive ego watered it perfectly. When Marcus confidently signed that holding company over to Chloe, he truly thought he was giving his new mistress the keys to the kingdom. He thought he was outsmarting the legal system and leaving me destitute. But corporate law is a brutal double-edged sword. When you legally transfer an asset, you also transfer the liabilities attached to it. By making Chloe the sole proprietor of that LLC, he legally removed my name from the massive debt. And because he executed the transfer so recklessly, he legally removed his own name from the protective structure of the assets. He legally made his 26-year-old assistant, who makes $40,000 a year, the sole debtor of a $4 million margin loan. The moment the bank algorithms registered that my income was no longer backing that LLC, they panicked. They immediately issued the margin call to protect their capital. And because Chloe has absolutely no real assets, the bank locked down every single account Marcus had access to because he was the original architect of the loan. He completely bankrupted himself to fund a toxic shell company that he then freely gave away to a girl who cannot even afford a decent corporate lawyer. Chloe is now legally responsible for a debt she can never repay in her entire lifetime. Her credit will be permanently destroyed. Her wages will be garnished forever. She wanted to play house in my mansion, and now she gets to face the bank foreclosure agents all by herself. I did not steal his money. I did not commit any financial fraud. I did not have to break a single law. I simply stepped out of the way and let his own arrogance push him straight off the cliff. He engineered his own destruction, and he happily paid the filing fees to do it. The trap was so perfectly designed that he locked himself inside and handed the only key to a girl who does not even know how to open the door. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling a profound sense of peace. The financial execution was complete. The bougie family was in ruins. The mistress was drowning in millions of dollars of debt. But the absolute best part of the show was yet to come. Because when a man like Marcus loses everything he values, he inevitably crawls back to the only person who ever actually knew how to fix his messes. I just had to wait for him to show up at my door. While Marcus was busy having his entire reality shattered on a downtown sidewalk, the legal machinery I had set in motion was already paying a visit to my former home. When a major financial institution issues a multi-million-dollar margin call and the accounts are frozen, they do not simply send a polite email. They send a registered process server. Back at the mansion, Chloe was having the absolute time of her life. According to the security cameras, which I still had remote access to, she was parading around the grand foyer in a silk robe, acting like actual royalty. She had two interior decorators walking behind her, taking notes as she pointed at my custom furniture and demanded it be thrown out. She was busy planning a massive renovation on a house she had owned for less than 24 hours, completely oblivious to the financial storm tearing toward her. Then the heavy brass doorbell rang. Chloe practically skipped to the door, expecting a delivery of expensive champagne, or perhaps the new designer luggage she had ordered the night before. She swung the heavy oak door open with a bright, arrogant smile. Standing on the front porch was a large man in a plain gray suit, holding a thick manila folder. He did not look impressed by the silk robe or the sweeping marble staircase behind her. He simply looked at a clipboard and asked if she was Chloe. "Yes, I am the homeowner," she replied, lifting her chin and using the title as if she had worked her entire life to earn it. The man nodded, handed her the thick manila folder and said, "You have been served." He turned around and walked back down the long paved driveway without another word. Chloe closed the door, her arrogant smile replaced by a frown of confusion. She walked over to the marble console table, the exact same table where I had dropped my keys the day before. She opened the folder and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. At the very top, in bold black letters, was a summons from the state Supreme Court. The plaintiff was the private bank. The defendant was the new LLC. And listed directly underneath the LLC as the sole responsible proprietor was her name. She scanned the first page, her eyes darting frantically across the dense legal jargon. She did not understand most of the corporate terminology, but she completely understood the massive bold number printed at the bottom of the page. $4 million, payable immediately upon receipt to satisfy a defaulted margin loan. The color completely drained from her face. Her hands started to tremble so violently that she dropped the thick stack of papers onto the marble floor. The pages scattered everywhere like a flock of terrifying white birds spreading bad news across the pristine foyer. Just 10 minutes later, the front door opened again. Marcus walked in. He looked absolutely terrible. His expensive Tom Ford suit was wrinkled and stained with sweat. His tie was loose and his hair was unkempt. He looked like a man who had just survived a terrible car crash. He closed the door heavily behind him and leaned against it, closing his eyes in total defeat. He did not even get the chance to take a single breath before Chloe was screaming at him. "What is this?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling manicured finger at the sea of legal documents scattered across the floor. "What did you do to me, Marcus?" Marcus opened his eyes and looked down at the papers. He recognized the bank logo instantly. He felt a cold, sickening wave of nausea wash over him. He slowly walked over, bent down, and picked up the summons. He read the front page and closed his eyes again, rubbing his temples. The bank was moving faster than he had ever anticipated. "Chloe, it is a misunderstanding." He started, his voice weak and completely devoid of its usual commanding authority. "It is an automated system response. The bank algorithm got confused when I transferred the holding company to you. They placed a temporary freeze on the accounts." "Temporary freeze?" Chloe yelled, stepping closer to him, her face twisted in absolute fury. "A man just showed up at my front door and handed me a lawsuit for $4 million. My name is on this paper, Marcus, not yours, not your wife, mine. The man told me I have been served. I do not have $4 million. I do not even have $4,000 in my checking account. I know, baby. I know," Marcus pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. "But I can fix it. I just spoke to the branch manager downtown. We just have to reverse the paperwork. I need you to sign the LLC back over to me right now. If we put the company back in my name, the algorithm will recognize my executive income and release the hold. The lawsuit will be dropped." Chloe stared at him. The young, naive girl who had looked at him with sheer adoration just 24 hours ago was completely gone. In her place stood a terrified, angry woman who was finally realizing she had been used as a pawn in a game she did not understand. She thought about the humiliating dinner the night before. She thought about his black card getting declined. She thought about the absolute panic in his eyes when he asked her to pay the bill. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together in her mind. "You do not have any money, do you?" Chloe asked, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Marcus flinched. "Of course I have money." He lied, desperately trying to salvage his massive ego. "It is just tied up right now. It is an algorithmic error, Chloe." Nia took her blind trust out of the portfolio and it triggered a margin call. Nia took her money out. Chloe repeated the realization, hitting her like a freight train. This was never your money. The cars, the designer, clothes, the expensive dinners. It was all her. You were just riding her coattails this entire time. You are a complete fraud. That is not true. Marcus yelled, his pride finally snapping. I am a senior director. I built that portfolio. You built a mountain of debt and you put my name on it! Chloe screamed back, stepping right into his face. You wanted to leave your wife with nothing, but you were too stupid to realize she was the only reason you had anything to begin with. And now you expect me to take the fall for your massive failure? Chloe, please! Marcus begged, his voice cracking. He tried to reach out and grab her hands, trying to use the same manipulative charm he had used to groom her in the office. Just sign the transfer papers. We can go to a notary right now. If you do not sign it back to me, they will seize my personal accounts forever. I will lose my job. I will lose my license. I will lose everything. Chloe violently snatched her hands away from him, as if his touch was physically burning her skin. You have already lost everything, Marcus. She spat, her voice dripping with pure venom. And you are absolutely delusional if you think I am going to sign another single piece of paper for you. If I sign those assets back to you, I am legally acknowledging that I participated in a fraudulent transfer to hide assets during a divorce. I watch the news, Marcus. I know what happens to people who play those games. I am not going to federal prison because you wanted to play a big shot billionaire. She took a step back, looking at his wrinkled suit and his defeated posture with absolute disgust. You told me I was going to be the lady of this house. You told me Nia was just a bitter old woman holding you back. But she is sitting somewhere in a luxury penthouse right now, laughing at you, while you stand here begging me for a bailout. You are a broke, middle-aged loser who got completely outsmarted by his own wife. Marcus opened his mouth to defend himself, but absolutely no words came out. There was no defense. Every single word she said was a devastating, irrefutable fact. I am going upstairs to pack my things, Chloe announced, her tone completely cold and transactional. I am taking every single piece of designer jewelry and clothing you bought me before yesterday. And then I am leaving. You can stay here and figure out how to explain this to the bank all by yourself. She turned around and stormed up the grand staircase, her silk robe trailing behind her. Marcus stood completely alone in the grand foyer, surrounded by the scattered white pages of the court summons. He stared after her, completely paralyzed by the brutal reality of his situation. His beautiful young mistress did not love him. She loved the illusion of his wealth. And the second that illusion shattered, so did her loyalty. He had destroyed his marriage, betrayed his wife, and alienated his family, all for a girl who turned on him the exact second the money dried up. Chloe stormed up the sweeping mahogany staircase, leaving Marcus completely paralyzed in the grand foyer. From the comfort of my downtown penthouse, I watched the entire meltdown unfold in glorious high definition through the hidden security cameras I had installed months ago. I took another sip of my coffee, watching Chloe tear through the master bedroom like a desperate tornado. She was not just packing the cheap designer knockoffs Marcus had bought her. She was opening my personal safes. When I moved out, I purposely left behind several extremely valuable items. There was a collection of vintage Rolex watches, a diamond tennis bracelet, and 3 small but incredibly expensive original oil paintings that hung in the dressing room. I knew exactly how Chloe operated. I knew that when she realized the massive mansion she just acquired was actually a financial prison, she would try to grab anything of value to pawn for quick cash. She thought because the house belonged to the LLC, the contents inside belonged to her too. But corporate law and property insurance are 2 very different games. I watched as she aggressively stuffed the diamond bracelet and 2 of the vintage watches into her oversized tote bag. She even pulled one of the oil paintings off the wall, frantically wrapping it in a silk pillowcase before shoving it into her designer luggage. She was moving fast, her face pale and covered in a cold sweat. She wanted to escape the multi-million-dollar debt before the bank could officially lock her down. Downstairs, Marcus was still standing in the foyer, staring blankly at the scattered court documents. He did not even try to stop her. His massive ego had been so thoroughly crushed that he was practically catatonic. He just watched as she dragged 2 heavy suitcases down the stairs, the tote bag full of stolen valuables slung over her shoulder. She did not say a single word to him as she marched past him toward the heavy oak front door. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. I set my coffee cup down on the marble counter and picked up my tablet. What Chloe did not understand, and what Marcus was too arrogant to ever verify, was that every single high-value item in that house was individually insured under a private policy in my name only. The watches, the jewelry, the art, they were not part of the holding company. They were my personal property, legally documented and protected by a premium insurance firm. By placing those items into her bag and attempting to remove them from the premises, Chloe was not just taking souvenirs, she was committing felony theft. In the state of Georgia, stealing property valued over $25,000 carries a mandatory prison sentence. I watched on the screen as she reached out and grabbed the brass handle of the front door. She pulled it open, letting the crisp afternoon air rush into the foyer. She took one step onto the front porch. I tapped a single button on my tablet screen. Instantly, a deafening high-decibel security alarm erupted throughout the entire mansion. The blaring siren echoed off the marble walls, completely shattering the quiet suburban neighborhood. Flashing red strobe lights pulsed from the ceiling corners. The automated security system voice began broadcasting a stern warning declaring that a perimeter breach had been detected and law enforcement was currently being dispatched. Chloe physically jumped backward, dropping the heavy suitcases on the porch. She covered her ears, her eyes wide with absolute terror. Marcus finally snapped out of his trance, covering his own ears and yelling over the deafening siren. He frantically punched his access code into the wall keypad, trying to disarm the system, but the keypad screen was completely dead. I had remotely locked him out of the master controls the second I left the house yesterday. The alarm was completely out of his hands. Through the hidden porch camera, I zoomed in on Chloe's face. The sheer panic in her eyes was spectacular to witness. She looked down at the oversized tote bag slung over her shoulder. She knew exactly what she had done. She knew that if the police arrived and found her carrying hundreds of thousands of dollars in stolen insured property, she would be walking away in handcuffs. The $4 million civil lawsuit was bad enough, but federal theft charges would ruin her entire life. The siren continued to wail, piercing the air with relentless intensity. Neighbors were already starting to step out of their houses to see what the commotion was about. Time was running out. Chloe made a split-second decision. She ripped the oversized tote bag off her shoulder and threw it violently onto the porch. The heavy watches and the diamond bracelet spilled out onto the concrete, glinting in the afternoon sun. She abandoned the designer luggage containing the stolen oil painting. She abandoned everything. She sprinted down the paved driveway, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the concrete. She did not run toward the street. She ran straight for the sleek black Porsche Panamera sitting in the driveway. The car Marcus had proudly claimed was property of her new LLC. She yanked the driver door open, threw herself into the premium leather seat, and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life with a massive surge of power. She threw the car into reverse tires, screeching against the pavement, leaving thick black skid marks as she violently backed out of the driveway. Marcus ran out onto the porch just in time to see his beautiful young mistress speed away in his favorite luxury car. He yelled her name, but his voice was completely drowned out by the relentless screaming of the security alarm. He watched the taillights of the Porsche disappear around the corner, leaving him entirely alone. He looked down at the scattered jewelry and the abandoned luggage at his feet. The reality of the situation washed over him in real time. He was standing on the porch of a house he no longer owned, listening to a blaring alarm he could not turn off, surrounded by stolen property he could not claim. He had absolutely no money, no car, no family, and no mistress. The first police cruiser pulled into the driveway, its red and blue lights flashing brightly against the massive white pillars of the mansion. Two officers stepped out, hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They walked up the driveway, eyeing the scattered diamond bracelet, the vintage Rolex watches, and the abandoned designer luggage. Marcus raised his hands in the air, a gesture of complete submission. He tried to explain the situation. He tried to use his big corporate words, telling the officers about limited liability companies and automated bank freezes and his status as a senior financial director. The officers did not care about his Wall Street vocabulary. They saw a disheveled man standing amidst a pile of highly insured valuables with a blaring security alarm going off behind him. They asked for his identification. Marcus reached into his pocket and handed over his driver license. The lead officer called the information into dispatch. A minute later, the officer looked at Marcus with a hard expression. The dispatcher confirmed that the property belonged to a corporate entity and the personal contents were registered to a woman named Naya. Marcus was neither the corporate owner nor the insured party. They placed him in handcuffs right there on the front porch. The loud click of the metal cuffs locking around his wrists was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. Marcus, the proud elite executive, was being detained for suspected burglary at the very house he had tried to steal from me. He begged the officers to call the branch manager at his bank. He begged them to call his sister Desiree, but Desiree was currently dealing with her own federal IRS raid, and the bank manager had already washed his hands of the entire mess. Marcus was completely on his own. They placed him in the back of the squad car while they cleared the house and secured my valuables. He sat there humiliated, pressing his face against the cold glass of the police cruiser. He watched as they carefully bagged my diamond bracelet and my vintage watches, treating my property with the exact respect he had failed to show me for 7 years. He had tried to leave me with nothing, but now he was the one sitting in the back of a police car with empty pockets and a destroyed reputation. Meanwhile, Chloe was tearing down the interstate. My investigator had easily pinged the GPS tracker I had installed in the Porsche months ago. She was driving frantically, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles were white. She had no destination. She just wanted to get as far away from the flashing lights and the court documents as possible. But running from a $4 million civil suit is like trying to outrun your own shadow. The debt was tied to her Social Security number. It would follow her to every apartment she tried to rent, every car she tried to buy, and every job she tried to hold. She was a walking financial ghost. The insurance trap was the perfect psychological weapon. It forced Chloe to abandon the only valuable assets she could have used to hire a decent defense attorney. It forced her to flee the scene, making her look incredibly guilty to the responding officers. And it left Marcus completely stranded to face the music alone. They both thought they were walking away with the ultimate prize. Instead, they had stripped themselves of every single defense mechanism they had left. Chloe was currently speeding down the highway, driving a stolen corporate vehicle toward a future filled with massive debt and legal ruin. Marcus was sitting in a police station, waiting for a public defender with absolutely zero leverage to negotiate his way out. The invincible hedge fund director who loved to brag about his brilliant financial strategies had been completely dismantled. But I knew Marcus better than anyone else in the world. I knew that when the police eventually cleared him of the burglary charges, and the reality of his total bankruptcy, fully set in his massive ego, would completely collapse. He would realize that his bougie family could not save him. He would realize that his young mistress had abandoned him. And he would realize that there was only one person left on the entire planet who possessed the financial brilliance to pull him out of this multi-million-dollar grave. He would come looking for me. Marcus spent the entire night sitting on a cold metal bench in a county holding cell. The police eventually released him the next morning. They realized the burglary was a highly convoluted civil dispute over corporate property, but the damage to his pride was already done. His mugshot was officially in the county system. He walked out of the precinct into the harsh morning light with absolutely nothing. He had no phone because the battery died overnight. He had no wallet because his accounts were completely frozen. He had to beg a stranger at a bus stop for $3 in loose change just to get back to the city center. He looked like a homeless man wearing a ruined Tom Ford suit. But in his delusional, arrogant mind, he believed he still had one safe haven left: his career. He was a managing director at a top-tier hedge fund. He figured he could walk into his massive corporate office, demand an emergency cash advance from payroll, and hire a bulldog lawyer to fix this massive misunderstanding. What Marcus failed to realize was that I never stop at a 99% victory. If you leave a venomous snake with its head still attached, it will eventually turn around and bite you. I needed to cut the head completely off. And the head of Marcus' massive ego was his corporate title. Over the past 2 years, while I was quietly separating my clean money from his toxic debt, I was also keeping very close track of his professional spending habits. Marcus was incredibly greedy in his marriage, but he was even greedier at work. He wanted to give his young mistress the absolute world, but he did not want to spend his own personal wealth to do it. So he used the company money. He was incredibly sloppy. I had hacked into his home office computer months ago and downloaded his uncensored corporate expense reports. I found out that he had been flying Chloe to Aspen and Paris on the company private jet, secretly coding the trips as international client acquisition meetings. I found the receipts for the thousands of dollars in vintage champagne and Wagyu beef he bought her, all written off as investor entertainment. He even used the hedge fund discretionary marketing budget to buy her a $30,000 Hermes Birkin bag. It was textbook corporate embezzlement, and he left a digital trail a mile wide. At exactly 8 in the morning, while Marcus was riding a smelly public bus toward the financial district, I hit send on the final email. I transmitted a fully encrypted, heavily documented dossier to the personal inboxes of the hedge fund chief executive officer, the chief compliance officer, and the entire board of directors. To ensure there would be absolutely no corporate cover-up, I carbon copied the regional director of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The digital file contained every single fraudulent receipt, every fake client meeting memo, and high-resolution photos of Chloe flaunting the stolen corporate assets on her public social media pages. It was an absolute corporate kill shot. Marcus finally arrived at his towering glass office building downtown. He smoothed down his wrinkled suit jacket, took a deep breath, and tried to project the image of a powerful executive. He walked through the grand marble lobby, ignoring the strange looks from the front desk receptionists, and headed straight for the private executive elevators. He pulled out his corporate keycard and swiped it against the security scanner. A sharp red light flashed. Access denied. He swiped it again, his frustration mounting. Red light again. Before he could turn around to yell at the lobby security guard, 2 large men in dark suits stepped up directly behind him. They were not the regular lobby guards. They were senior corporate risk management officers. They flanked Marcus on both sides and quietly informed him that he needed to come with them immediately. They escorted him to a service elevator, completely bypassing the luxurious executive floors, and took him straight to the underground legal compliance office. When the heavy metal doors opened, Marcus walked into a small, windowless conference room. Sitting at the long table was the chief executive officer, the head of human resources, and 2 senior corporate attorneys. Marcus tried to put on his usual charming, arrogant smile. He started to make a joke about the keycard scanner being broken in the lobby, but the chief executive cut him off instantly. The man did not yell. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of printed documents. It was the exact dossier I had sent them just an hour earlier. He tossed the thick stack onto the center of the table. The glossy photo of Chloe posing with the stolen Birkin bag on the company jet was right on top. The chief executive looked Marcus dead in the eye and asked him to explain exactly why the firm was funding a 26-year-old mistress luxury vacations under the guise of global investor relations. Marcus stared at the photographs. The color drained from his face for the 3rd time in 48 hours. He opened his mouth to formulate a brilliant public relations spin, but his brain completely short-circuited. There was no spin for this. There was no clever legal loophole he could crawl through. The evidence was absolutely irrefutable. The chief compliance officer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and delivered the fatal blow. He calmly informed Marcus that the Securities and Exchange Commission had already been notified of the massive financial irregularities. "You are terminated for cause effective immediately," the chief executive said, his voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You have explicitly violated your fiduciary duty, committed blatant corporate fraud, and exposed this entire firm to massive federal liability. Because you are being fired for gross criminal misconduct, you forfeit all of your unvested stock options. You will receive absolutely no severance package." Our legal team is actively drafting a civil suit to recover the embezzled funds, and we will be fully cooperating with the federal authorities regarding your criminal prosecution." The compliance officer added the final devastating nail to the coffin. He told Marcus that his Series 7 and Series 24 financial licenses were suspended immediately pending the federal investigation. He was officially blacklisted from the financial industry forever. No reputable firm on Wall Street or anywhere else in the entire country would ever hire him to manage so much as a lemonade stand. His prestigious career, the only thing he truly valued more than his own reflection, was completely dead. They did not even let him go back up to his luxurious corner office to pack his personal belongings. Human Resources had already dumped a few family photos and his favorite coffee mug into a cheap cardboard box. The security officers handed him the box and physically escorted him out the back service door into a dirty, damp alleyway behind the massive skyscraper. They confiscated his corporate cell phone, his company laptop, and his building access badge. Marcus stood alone in the dark alleyway holding a small cardboard box, staring blankly at the brick wall. Just 48 hours ago, he was standing in a custom-built mansion, drinking expensive vintage wine, plotting to throw me out on the street with absolutely nothing. He thought he was an untouchable member of the black elite. He thought he was a master manipulator who could treat people like disposable garbage and walk away perfectly clean. Now he was a penniless outcast. He had no wife. His beautiful young mistress had abandoned him and fled in a stolen car. His snobby sister and arrogant brother-in-law were currently facing federal prison for their own financial crimes. He had no home, no money, no credit cards, and absolutely no career. He had been completely erased from the high society world he worshipped. Every single pillar of his fake perfect life had been systematically demolished. And the absolute most beautiful part of this entire masterpiece was that he built the bombs himself and practically begged me to light the match. By 7 o'clock that evening, a massive thunderstorm had rolled over the city of Atlanta. The sky turned a bruised purple, and thick sheets of rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse. I was sitting on my plush velvet sofa, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, sipping a hot cup of chamomile tea. The ambient temperature in my apartment was a perfect 72 degrees. The soft jazz playing through the surround sound speakers made the chaotic storm outside feel like a silent movie. Everything in my world was finally perfectly ordered. Then the heavy buzzing of the private elevator lobby intercom shattered the peace. It was not a polite single ring. It was a frantic, desperate hammering. Someone was leaning their entire body weight against the call button. I did not rush. I slowly set my teacup down on the glass coffee table and picked up my security tablet. I tapped the screen to access the high-definition camera in the private vestibule outside my front door. There he was, Marcus. He looked absolutely pathetic. The rain had completely destroyed his tailored Tom Ford suit. The expensive fabric was plastered to his skin, dark and heavy with water. His silk tie was gone. His shoes, the custom Italian leather loafers he obsessed over, were scuffed and soaked. He was shivering violently, his arms wrapped tightly around his own chest. But it was his face that gave away the true depth of his nightmare. His eyes were wide and darting frantically around the small vestibule. He kept looking back at the elevator doors as if he expected someone to burst through them at any second. He was terrified, and I knew exactly why. When a major financial institution issues a $4 million margin call, and you try to dodge it by transferring assets, they do not just send a single process server and give up. The bank had immediately sold the defaulted debt to a highly aggressive private collection firm. On top of that, the hedge fund had unleashed their own team of corporate hounds to track him down and recover the embezzled funds. According to my investigator, Marcus had been shadowed all afternoon by unmarked cars. They were actively hunting him, waiting for him to slip up. He had nowhere to run. His credit was frozen. He could not check into a hotel. He could not buy a bus ticket. He could not even call an Uber because his phone had been confiscated by his former employer. He was a fugitive in his own city, hunted by the very financial systems he used to manipulate. Marcus looked directly up into the glowing red lens of the security camera. He knew I was watching. He pressed his wet hands against the heavy mahogany door and started pleading with the lens. "Nia, please. He begged, his voice muffled but clearly audible through the intercom speaker. Nia, I know you are in there. Please let me in. They are following me. There was a black SUV waiting outside the police station, and another one parked outside the corporate office. I had to walk 3 miles in the rain to lose them. I am freezing, Nia. I have absolutely nothing. Please just open the door. I sat on my sofa and watched him beg. I watched the man who had stood in my kitchen just 3 days ago and confidently told me I had 24 hours to pack my bags and vacate his property. He had smirked at me. He had mocked my career. He had bragged about leaving me destitute so he could play house with his young mistress. He genuinely believed that he held the power of life and death over my future. Now he was a soaking wet beggar, pounding on my door, praying for a scrap of mercy. I let him stand there for 5 full minutes. I wanted him to feel the cold biting into his bones. I wanted him to feel the absolute terror of being completely exposed and vulnerable to a world that no longer cared about his corporate titles or his fake elite status. Every second he stood shivering in that vestibule was a second of pure, unfiltered reality. Nia, I am sorry, he sobbed, pressing his forehead against the wet wood of the door. I am so sorry. I made a mistake. Chloe left me. Trent is going to prison. The bank took everything. I was stupid. You were right about everything. Please do not leave me out here to die. He was crying. Actual tears were mixing with the rainwater streaming down his face. The great Marcus, the pride of the black elite, the untouchable Wall Street director, was reduced to a crying child, locked out in the dark. I finally stood up from the sofa. I smoothed out my silk lounge pants and walked slowly across the warm hardwood floor. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man outside my door. Pity is reserved for victims of unfortunate circumstances. Marcus was not a victim. He was the architect of his own destruction. He had intentionally built a bomb, placed it in the center of our marriage, and handed the detonator to a 26-year-old girl. He just forgot to check if the blast doors were locked before it went off. I stopped just a few inches away from the heavy mahogany door. I could hear his ragged breathing through the thick wood. I reached out and rested my hand on the cool metal of the deadbolt. I knew that the moment I turned this lock, the final chapter of his punishment would begin. I was not going to let him inside to warm up. I was not going to offer him a towel or a hot shower. I was going to open this door just wide enough to let him look at the beautiful, peaceful life he had thrown away. And then I was going to deliver the final killing blow to his massive ego. I took a deep breath, letting the sweet smell of my expensive candles fill my lungs. I flipped the deadbolt. The heavy metal lock clicked loudly, echoing in the quiet hallway. Marcus immediately stopped crying. He stood up straight, trying desperately to compose himself. He thought the click of the lock meant salvation. He thought his brilliant, successful wife was finally going to swoop in and fix his massive multi-million-dollar mess, just like she had always done in the past. He was so incredibly wrong. I grabbed the brass handle and pulled the door open. The cold, damp air from the hallway rushed in, carrying the smell of wet wool and sheer desperation. Marcus stood there trembling, looking at me with wide, hopeful eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another pathetic, empty apology or demand another desperate favor, but I did not give him the chance to say a single word. Marcus took half a step forward, clearly intending to push past me into the warmth of the penthouse. He reached out with his wet hands, desperate to grab my arm and pull me into his miserable reality. I did not move backward. Instead, I simply lifted my right leg and pressed the sharp-pointed tip of my black designer stiletto directly against the center of his soaked chest. The sharp pressure of the heel stopped him dead in his tracks. He looked down at my shoe and then back up at my face, his eyes wide with shock. He suddenly realized that the physical barrier between my luxurious sanctuary and his freezing nightmare was absolute. "Do not take another step, Marcus," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any warmth. "You are dripping puddle water all over my imported rug." The sheer coldness of my tone completely broke whatever fragile remaining spirit he had left. His legs literally gave out from underneath him. He collapsed, dropping heavily onto both knees on the hard floor of the vestibule. He looked up at me from the ground, his shoulders shaking violently. It was the exact visual representation of the power dynamic we should have had all along. For 7 years I had elevated him and placed him on a pedestal he did not earn. Now gravity and his own massive ego had pulled him exactly where he belonged. Down in the dirt. Nia, I have nothing, he choked out, his voice cracking as he stared up at me. They fired me. They took my licenses. Chloe took the car and ran. I do not have a dollar to my name, and the police are treating me like a criminal. I know I was wrong. I know I messed up everything, but you are the only one who knows how to fix this. Please let me come inside. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever you want. Just tell me how to make it stop. I looked down at the man who used to confidently wear $1,000 suits and command boardrooms. His expensive watch, the one I bought him for our anniversary, was ruined by the rain. His custom Italian leather shoes were scuffed and leaving muddy streaks on the pristine tile. I searched my heart for a single shred of sympathy and found absolutely nothing. I took a slow sip of my tea, enjoying the soothing warmth sliding down my throat while he shivered uncontrollably at my feet. You want me to tell you how to make it stop? I asked, taking my time, letting the silence stretch between us. You cannot make it stop, Marcus. That is the beauty of a perfectly executed crisis management strategy. Once the final variable is introduced, the reaction is completely unstoppable. And you were the one who introduced the final variable when you signed that LLC over to your little assistant. He stared at me, water dripping from his eyelashes onto his cheeks. He looked like a wounded animal begging for a savior. But I am not a savior. I am an executioner. You really thought you outsmarted me? I continued, keeping my voice low and steady. You stood in my kitchen just 3 days ago and smirked at me. You told me I was going to walk away with absolutely nothing. You dug your own grave thinking a black woman would just sit and cry when betrayed. You thought because I grew up on the South Side I would just scream and make a massive scene so you could paint me as the bitter, angry wife. You wanted me to lose my mind so you could justify leaving me for a younger, softer version of a woman. You thought because I did not throw plates at your head that I was simply accepting defeat. You completely forgot who you married. I do not throw tantrums, Marcus. I throw financial grenades. I lowered my foot, taking a small step back but keeping my posture tall and commanding. I wanted him to see every inch of my unbothered perfection. You thought you built our empire, I said, shaking my head slowly in disgust. You loved walking around telling your bougie little family that you were the ultimate provider. You loved letting your sister Desiree insult my working-class roots while you quietly spent my money to fund your elite lifestyle. You were never the king, Marcus. You were just a highly paid mascot. I built the throne. I managed the accounts. I pulled the strings behind every single promotion you ever received. And the second you decided to bite the hand that fed you, I simply stopped feeding you. He let out a pathetic sob, wrapping his arms around his waist. He tried to speak, but I held up a single finger, demanding absolute silence. He closed his mouth instantly, completely submissive to my authority. Do you know what is so incredibly funny about your brilliant master plan? I asked, taking another sip of my tea. You were so blinded by your own greed and your desperate midlife crisis that you did not even bother to read the basic financial disclosures of your own portfolio. You gave Chloe an empty corporate shell carrying $4 million in toxic margin debt. You essentially handed her a ticking time bomb and locked her inside the room with it. You wanted to give her my life, but instead, you gave her your absolute ruin. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, his face contorting in agony. He was finally seeing the entire picture. The heavy fog of his arrogance had lifted, leaving behind nothing but the brutal, unforgiving truth. And do not even think about calling Trent or Desiree for a bailout, I added, my tone sharpening like a blade. You remember the $50,000 your brother-in-law begged me for last year? Well, the Internal Revenue Service finally got a hold of his offshore banking records. Federal agents raided his tech startup this morning. They seized his passports and froze all his accounts. Desiree is currently packing her bags to leave him, and he is facing a decade in federal prison. Your entire fake elite family is imploding at this exact very moment because they built their entire identity on lies and stolen money. Marcus gasped, his eyes snapping open. He stared at me with pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood the absolute magnitude of the destruction I had unleashed upon his life. It was not just a divorce, it was a complete systematic annihilation of every single thing he held dear. "You did this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You destroyed everything." "I destroyed absolutely nothing," I corrected him, my voice echoing coldly in the small space. "I simply removed my protection and let your own terrible decisions catch up to you. You destroyed your career when you embezzled corporate funds to buy luxury handbags for a 26-year-old. You destroyed your wealth when you tried to hide assets in a fraudulent transfer. You destroyed your family when you chose your massive ego over the woman who actually built you. I just sat back and watched you pull the trigger." He lowered his head until his forehead was resting against the cold floor of the vestibule. He had no arguments left. He had no lies left to tell. He was completely stripped bare. The powerful hedge fund director was dead, and all that remained was a broken man crying in the rain. I looked down at him one last time. There was no anger left in my heart. There was only the cold, hard satisfaction of a job perfectly executed. I had successfully managed the biggest crisis of my personal life, and I came out on the other side completely untouched. The heavy silence in the vestibule was suddenly broken by a harsh, buzzing sound. It was coming from the inside pocket of Marcus' ruined suit jacket. He had begged a desk sergeant at the police precinct to let him charge his dead personal cell phone for 10 minutes before they threw him out onto the street. He reached into his wet pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out the device. The screen was cracked, but the caller identification was glowing brightly in the dim light of the hallway. It was Desiree. He looked up at me, panic flashing across his face. "Answer it!" I commanded, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "And put it on speaker. I want to hear exactly how the Black Elite handles a real crisis." He swiped the screen and dropped the phone onto the floor between us, his hands shaking too violently to hold it. Desiree's voice instantly filled the small space, and it was a sound of pure, unadulterated hysteria. "Marcus." She screamed, her voice cracking so hard it sounded like she was physically choking. "Where are you? Why have you not answered my calls? We are losing everything, Marcus. The federal agents did not just take the computers, they took the house." Marcus stared blankly at the phone on the floor. "What do you mean they took the house?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over her sobbing. "They froze the mortgage," Desiree wailed loudly. "Trent used the house as collateral for his fake tech startup loans. The bank is foreclosing right now. They gave us 3 hours to pack our personal belongings and vacate the premises. Trent is in federal custody, and his lawyer will not even return my calls because the retainer check bounced. I am sitting on the front lawn with my designer suitcases in the pouring rain, Marcus. My friends from the country club are driving past me and staring. You have to come get me. You have to send a wire transfer from the hedge fund right now to bail Trent out." Marcus closed his eyes. The last shred of his arrogant delusion was actively dying right in front of him. He had spent his entire life looking up to his family, looking down on everyone else, and believing their wealth was a permanent shield against the consequences of their own actions. "I do not have any money, Desiree." He choked out, tears spilling over his eyelashes again. "What are you talking about?" Desiree snapped, her panic instantly morphing into vicious anger. "You are a senior director. You make millions of dollars. Stop playing games and help your family." "They fired me," he cried, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "The board fired me this morning. Nia sent them the receipts for Chloe. They took my licenses. The bank froze my personal accounts to cover the LLC margin call. I am broke, Desiree. I am locked out of the house. I am sitting on the floor outside Nia penthouse begging her to take me back." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For a long moment, the only sound in the vestibule was the heavy rain beating against the windows behind me. Desiree, the woman who had spent 7 years mocking my South Side roots, the woman who claimed I was dragging her brother down, was finally processing the reality of her situation. She was homeless, her husband was a federal criminal, and the brother she worshipped, the golden child of the family, was a penniless fraud. "You idiot!" She suddenly screamed, her voice vibrating with a hatred so deep it made the phone speaker crackle. "You absolute stupid, arrogant idiot! You ruined us! You could not just keep your pants zipped and let your wife run the finances. You had to play the big shot. You had to steal from your own company for a cheap assistant. You are not a director, Marcus. You are a massive failure. Do not ever call me again. You are dead to me." The call disconnected with a sharp beep. The screen went black. Marcus stared at the dead phone, his mouth hanging open. His own sister, the person he had desperately tried to impress his entire adult life, had just discarded him like actual garbage. The united front of the bougie family, the impenetrable fortress of their high society image, had completely burned to the ground. There was nothing left but ashes. I looked down at him and allowed myself a small, genuine smile. "That is the problem with fake wealth, Marcus," I said, stepping around the puddle he had created on my floor. "You all built your identities on things you could buy and titles you could flaunt. But you never actually built character. You never built loyalty. When the money disappeared, the family disappeared with it, because the money was the only thing holding you together." He did not respond. He could not respond. He was completely catatonic. The psychological execution was flawless. I had not just taken his money or his career, I had systematically dismantled the very core of his identity. I made sure he saw with his own two eyes that his elite status was a complete illusion. He was nobody. He was nothing. "You spent our entire marriage making me feel like I was not good enough for your world." I continued, my voice calm and steady. "You let your sister disrespect me at every holiday dinner. You let Trent talk down to me about his fake tech millions. You thought because I did not wear flashy logos or brag about my bank accounts that I was somehow beneath you. But true power does not need to shout, Marcus. True power is quiet. It watches. It calculates. And when it strikes, it leaves absolutely nothing behind." He reached out a trembling hand toward my shoe, but he did not dare touch me. "Nia, please," he whispered one final time, looking up at me with hollow, dead eyes. "Where am I supposed to go? I have nowhere to go." "That is not my problem," I replied, looking down at him with absolute indifference. "You wanted a new life. You wanted to be free of me. Congratulations, Marcus. You are completely free. You have the entire city of Atlanta to explore. I suggest you start walking before building security finds you loitering in my private vestibule." I did not wait for him to process the finality of my words. I stepped back into the warm, glowing sanctuary of my penthouse. The air smelled of expensive vanilla and absolute freedom. I looked at him one last time. He was still kneeling on the cold floor, a broken, defeated shell of a man who had gambled a diamond to win a piece of cheap glass and lost everything in the process. I reached into the pocket of my silk lounge pants. My fingers brushed against a piece of crisp paper. I had kept it with me for the past 2 days, waiting for the perfect moment to return it to its rightful owner. I pulled the folded paper from my pocket and held it out between my index and middle fingers. Marcus looked up, his red, puffy eyes tracking my hand. He did not immediately recognize what I was holding. His brain was too overloaded with his own massive failures to process the visual. I slowly unfolded the paper, letting him see the face of the $100 bill. It was the exact same bill that Chloe had condescendingly dropped at my feet in the driveway of my old mansion. The money she had arrogantly told me to use to call an Uber back to the South Side. I extended my arm slightly and opened my fingers. The crisp bill fluttered in the cold, damp draft of the hallway. It drifted back and forth before landing perfectly in the dirty puddle of rainwater right next to his scuffed Italian leather shoes. "Use her money to call an Uber," I said, my voice ringing with absolute finality. "Game over, Marcus." I grabbed the heavy brass handle of the door. As the heavy wood began to swing shut, the brutal reality of his total isolation finally snapped his frozen mind back to life. He lunged forward, letting out a desperate, primal scream. It was not a word or a plea. It was just a raw, guttural sound of pure terror. He reached out with both hands, trying to wedge his fingers into the doorframe to stop me from closing him out forever. But he was too slow, and his wet leather shoes slipped completely on the slick marble tile. He fell forward, his chin striking the hard floor just as I pulled the door firmly shut. The heavy deadbolt engaged automatically with a loud metallic clack. The thick soundproofing of the luxury penthouse did its job flawlessly. The instant the door sealed, the chaotic nightmare unfolding in the hallway was completely erased from my reality. I stood in my private entryway, surrounded by the warm scent of vanilla and the soft rhythm of my jazz music. There was absolute perfect silence. I turned my attention to the security monitor mounted on the wall next to the door. Through the high-definition camera, I watched the silent movie of his final breakdown. Marcus scrambled to his knees and threw his entire body weight against the heavy mahogany door. He pounded his fists against the solid wood, his mouth open in a continuous silent scream. He hit the door over and over again until his knuckles must have been bruised and bleeding. He pressed his face against the wood, begging a woman who could no longer hear him and no longer cared. He looked so incredibly small. The terrifying hedge fund director, the man who controlled millions of dollars and dictated the lives of everyone around him, was nothing more than a pathetic temper tantrum on a security screen. After several minutes of useless pounding, he finally gave up. He slumped against the doorframe, sliding down until he was sitting in his own puddle of rainwater. He looked down at the $100 bill resting by his foot. He slowly reached out with a trembling hand, picked up the wet, crumpled money, and clutched it to his chest. It was the only asset he had left in the entire world. The elevator doors at the end of the hall suddenly slid open. Two large building security guards stepped into the vestibule. The concierge must have seen him on the lobby cameras. The guards walked over to Marcus and ordered him to leave. He did not try to fight them. He did not try to use his corporate vocabulary to intimidate them. All the fight had been completely drained out of him. The guards grabbed him by the arms of his ruined suit jacket and physically hauled him to his feet. They dragged him toward the elevator. He kept his head down, staring at the floor as the metal doors closed behind him, swallowing him up and removing him from my life forever. I reached out and pressed the power button on the security monitor. The screen faded to black. I walked away from the front door and headed into my expansive living room. The storm outside was still raging, throwing heavy sheets of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows, but it felt like a celebration. I poured myself another cup of hot chamomile tea and sank back into the plush velvet cushions of my sofa. I took a deep breath, letting the clean, conditioned air fill my lungs. For the first time in 7 years, I felt completely physically light. I thought about the massive, suffocating weight of his family expectations that I had carried for so long. The dinners where I bit my tongue to keep the peace. The brilliant financial maneuvers I executed in the shadows just so he could feel like the man of the house. I realized that the greatest victory in all of this was not seeing him destroyed or watching his fake elite family crumble. The greatest victory was taking my own life back. I was no longer a supporting character in his delusional reality. I was the sole author of my own future. He would be sleeping on a bus bench or in a holding cell tonight, surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogance. He would wake up tomorrow to a swarm of angry creditors, federal investigators, and a lifetime of unpayable debt. I would wake up in a king-sized bed with a fresh start and a booming business. I had successfully excised a massive toxic tumor from my life without shedding a single drop of my own blood. I looked out at the city skyline glowing through the rain. Every single light represented a new possibility. I had built a massive financial empire once while carrying a dead weight on my back. Now I was completely unburdened and absolutely unstoppable. I turned away from the floor-to-ceiling windows and walked over to the custom-built marble wet bar in the corner of my living room. I bypassed the herbal tea I had been drinking earlier. The storm outside had finally begun to settle into a quiet, steady rain, and the occasion officially called for something with a little more celebration. I reached into the chilled wine fridge and pulled out a bottle of vintage champagne. The heavy crystal bottle felt cold and solid in my hands. I popped the cork, letting the sharp, satisfying sound echo through the quiet penthouse. I poured the golden liquid into a tall crystal flute, watching the tiny bright bubbles rise rapidly to the surface. It looked exactly like victory. I carried the glass back to my velvet sofa and sat down, crossing my legs and resting my head against the plush cushions. I took a slow, appreciative sip. The champagne was crisp and perfectly chilled. For 7 long years, I had allowed myself to be cast in the role of the quiet, supporting wife to a man who desperately needed to be the star of a show I was secretly directing. Society teaches women, especially Black women, that we are supposed to endure. We are conditioned to be the ultimate ride or die partners. We are told to absorb the disrespect, manage the financial burdens, and smile politely while our partners and their toxic families disrespect our boundaries. We are expected to gracefully carry the weight of their insecurities and applaud them for simply showing up. Marcus and his bougie family relied heavily on that exact expectation. They expected me to shrink so they could feel tall. They expected me to fund their delusions of grandeur while accepting their subtle daily insults about my working-class roots. But what they completely failed to understand is that endurance is not the same thing as submission. I endured their toxic behavior not because I was weak, but because I was calculating my exact exit strategy. Your value does not suddenly decrease just because someone else lacks the proper currency to afford you. Marcus wanted the benefits of a highly successful, intelligent wife, but he possessed the emotional maturity of a greedy child. He wanted to play the role of the elite Wall Street billionaire without putting in the actual integrity required to maintain that life. When he looked at Chloe, he did not see a partner. He saw a mirror that reflected only the lies he wanted to believe about himself. He wanted someone who would blindly worship him instead of someone who could accurately evaluate him. And in his desperate rush to secure that cheap validation, he happily traded a solid diamond for a fragile piece of glass that shattered the second the pressure was applied. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true boundaries are not just imaginary lines you draw in the sand, hoping people will respect them. True boundaries are massive brick walls topped with barbed wire, and you must be absolutely willing to let people crash their cars into them if they refuse to hit the brakes. I never raised my voice. I never threw a single plate. I never sent a single angry text message. I simply built a financial and legal wall around my peace and allowed Marcus to drive himself right into it at full speed. We often spend so much time agonizing over the people who betray us. We cry over the lost years and wonder why our loyalty was repaid with such cruelty. But the truth is, you cannot heal in the exact same environment that made you sick. You have to be willing to walk away from the table when respect is no longer being served. You have to be willing to pack your bags, secure your assets, and let the people who took you for granted experience the absolute brutal reality of your absence. Marcus thought my silence during his betrayal was a sign of my defeat. He did not realize that silence is the ultimate weapon of the strategist. When you remove your emotional reaction, you completely blind your enemy. You leave them swinging wildly in the dark while you quietly step out of the way and let gravity do the rest of the work. You do not always need to seek active revenge. Sometimes the most devastating revenge in the world is simply removing your grace, your money, and your protection, and letting their own toxic nature take its natural course. They will inevitably destroy themselves with the very same greed they tried to use against you. I raised my crystal flute to the empty room, offering a quiet toast to new beginnings, to absolute financial independence, and to the beautiful, unbreakable power of knowing exactly what you are worth. This journey was never just about a divorce or a failed holding company. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. It was about proving that you do not have to accept the disrespect of a toxic partner or their entitled family just to keep up appearances. You have the power to rewrite the ending of your own story at any given moment. Now I want to turn it over to you. Have you ever stood back and watched the people who tried to break you destroy themselves with their own greed? Share your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe in the power of walking away and letting karma handle the rest. Remember to always protect your peace, secure your assets, and never ever apologize for surviving.